Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a privilege to be here with you all on the lands of the Moanina people, and I acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people who provide ongoing care for this beautiful state, which I'm lucky to call home also. And whilst I can't see your faces, so this is a really weird experience, it's lovely to see some familiar names popping up on the attendee list. So I know you're out there. Thank you. So despite my long-standing engagement with homelessness as a lived experience and social policy and service delivery conundrum in Australia, the story I have for you today actually has its starting point in a problematic misconceptualisation of homelessness. And it's a classic tale about the ways in which social problems can become entrenched and naturalised in our imaginaries, especially when they have a shared definition supported in multiple sectors and professions, in this case across the arenas of academic research, state and federal policy and data collection, and the dominant design and delivery of support and accommodation services in the homeless sector. My talk centres on unaccompanied homeless children, the lives of adversity that they live, and more positively, what I think are some key starting points for bringing an end to the homelessness and lack of care some children experience in this state. So unaccompanied homeless children are those children who experience homelessness alone and who are not consistently in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. Whilst those who receive child protection services can also, of course, experience unaccompanied homelessness, the focus of my research and my talk today is on those who are unaccompanied and homeless and without access to child protection services. So these are children who typically fall between systems, and they're often characterised as too young for specialist homeless services, but too old for child protection, and as being able to self-protect. In reality, they experience cumulative harm and trauma. They sleep rough, couch surf between extended family, friends and acquaintances, and intermittently cycle between the few SHS beds available in Tasmania. So the first of just 4 points that I'm going to touch on today is about the relative invisibility of unaccompanied children's homelessness. And by this I mean that with the exception of New South Wales, states and territories have little or no policy which sets the stage for responding to their needs through targeted service delivery. Nor do they have the services to target to the unique care needs of this particular cohort. Understanding this lack of visibility and subsequent lack of care provision is crucial to appreciating the extreme vulnerability and risk that they experience across all domains of wellbeing. It is the case that our understanding of and responses to unaccompanied homeless children has been traditionally subsumed under family and youth homelessness. The homelessness sector in Australia more broadly currently encompasses youth, adult and domestic violence peaks and services, for example. Children are not part of our framework of advocacy or often of our responses to homelessness. So the homelessness of children has been understood largely as homelessness by default, where they are accompanying dependents of adults experiencing homelessness, for example. Where they experience homelessness alone without a parent or guardian, children have been traditionally incorporated into the category of youth homelessness, where the category of youth can problematically encompass those aged 12 right through to those who are 24. For highly politicised reasons, I'd suggest, it's long been the case that talking about children's homelessness as youth homelessness has been more acceptable. Acknowledging the existence of unaccompanied homeless children poses the political, legal and moral problem of who has responsibility for them. I think we also find that it's simply quite difficult to imagine that children might experience homelessness alone. We can't quite bring ourselves to acknowledge that children, young children, may experience homelessness alone. And we also assume that surely if any child did, then Child Protection Services would be immediately involved and responsible. But this is certainly not the case. Given how quickly children who are homeless are forced to grow up, I think we've uncritically imagined them and referred to them and interacted with them and provided services for them as youth. And it's also out of respect for their resilient survival and self-identity that many may refer to them as young people. And this is something I've certainly struggled with in my own research, resulting, however, I think, in a lack of clarity about the unique developmental needs of children and how these need to be specifically addressed in an integrated manner in the context of homelessness. So my second point today is that unaccompanied homeless children do exist in Australia. In fact, 14,000 presented alone to specialist homeless services in 2018 to 19. 3,000 of whom were aged 10 to 14, and nearly 6,000 of whom were identified as presenting with mental health issues. In Tasmania, in the same financial year, 410 children aged 10 to 17 presented alone to specialist homeless services, 256 of whom were recorded as experiencing a current mental health issue. What you should be noticing, quite apart from the frightening scale of some of those numbers, is that these numbers actually only reflect those accessing specialist homeless services. Yet here in Tasmania, 7 of our youth services accommodate only from age 13, with one newer service accommodating from age 12. And in many other states, youth services may only accommodate those aged over 16. In my research with vulnerable children in Tasmania, though, kids made it clear that they actually start leaving home sometime between ages 10 and 13. In other words, they're not even able to access the services that do exist. And in my work, they made it really clear that they're often not aware of youth homelessness services, or if they were, they're quite afraid of them, given they accommodate young adults up to age 20. And sometimes with shared bedroom facilities. So the key point here is that using service data to estimate the population size of unaccompanied homeless children is really problematic, a fact which contributes to the continuing invisibility and undercounting of this cohort. Now, the third point I want to make is that the research Anglicare has been funding has really significantly contributed to a deeper understanding of unaccompanied children's lives and of the range of personal and systemic challenges they face in surviving both that lack of effective guardianship and a lack of a safe, secure place to call home. And drawing from some of my own research undertaken in Tasmania, I'll just briefly characterise for you the range of issues these kids can encounter. And this is going to set the scene for my final point, and I hope our broader collaborative conversation about what is needed to prevent unaccompanied child homelessness, to respond well when it does occur, and to ultimately make the shift to a legislative, policy and service environment, all oriented to ending unaccompanied child homelessness. So in 2016-17 in Tasmania, I conducted life story work with a small number of children aged 14 to 17 who had experiences of unaccompanied homelessness. And this research revealed that violence and abandonment were core shared experiences across participants' lives. Family violence, sexual and physical abuse, and sexual and physical violence were repeated experiences through childhood and into adolescence for those taking part in my research. Alongside the impacts of complex trauma resulting from violence and abuse, children described a profound and deeply disturbing sense of abandonment by parents and caregivers and other adults who actively hurt them or who were just simply unable to keep them safe, often because of their own complex needs. Some had parents who died, who went to jail, who simply left without explanation, or who were perhaps absent from the beginning. Siblings too came and went as parents separated from partners and made new relationships. So children had chaotic family and physical living environments in which care could not be relied on and attachments remained thin. So even for those children who did not experience violence or abuse during childhood, and there were only a few of those, there was nonetheless a profound experience of an absence of care and protection, and a lot of grief and disorientation associated with this. Compounding children's experience of violence, neglect, or sense of abandonment were also their experiences of being responsible for, in fact, providing care for others, for siblings, parents, and grandparents. And for example, children describe providing physical and emotional care and protection for siblings and mothers during and after episodes of domestic violence. They also provided support and care for parents with physical and mental illness and for ailing grandparents. Now, the intensity of early childhood suffering, stress, and adult responsibility in children's lives cannot be underestimated. And eventually, between 10 and 13 years old, children commonly described reaching breaking points at which their mental and physical health often began deteriorating dramatically, and they began couch surfing to escape their current home circumstances. As one child described it, "I just couldn't take it anymore." As you might guess, however, children's experiences of couch surfing were also marked by sexual and physical violence, intimate partner violence, standover, and exposure to drug use. Children described sleeping rough and also accessed specialist homeless services, but predominantly for those participating in my research, it was just a roundabout of insecure staying with friends and even periods of returning to unsafe homes, actually, through which they cobbled together our ongoing shelter. Unaccompanied children also experienced extreme poverty. Often they were too young to receive youth allowance. Survival crimes such as trespassing and stealing food, hygiene products and clothing became necessary, as did a risky reliance on friends and acquaintances for food, shelter and transport. And at the same time as they were exiting home, experiencing homelessness, sometimes becoming involved with older youth and more serious crime, they're also losing contact with their own peers and exiting school environments. Together, it was bullying and suspensions which turned school into yet another alienating environment that children were in turn becoming old enough to also reject and escape, often from year 6 onwards. So my research with this cohort of children led to a range of subsequent projects focused on their care and protection needs, on their lack of access to school. And the final project in that suite of work was going to be responding to the distressing mental health issues that children also described. It still is, but of course COVID intervened and put a stop to it, but hopefully that work will continue or restart later this year. And it's going to look at unaccompanied homeless children's experience of mental ill health in more depth and consider what kind of response, service response and system response would best meet their unique needs. During the COVID emergency, I also conducted work monitoring the negative impacts of the withdrawal and reduction of face-to-face service provision to this highly vulnerable group. and have been really advocating strongly for the critical importance of face-to-face service continuity during public health emergencies, and for the urgent need, the urgent outstanding need for, in some cases, for COVID planning for unaccompanied homeless children, and for the diverse range of child and youth serving organisations which have contact with them. So, and this is point 4, it's always really annoying in short talks that for the good bit, the solutions, to actually make sense, you do have to spend some time laying out an understanding of what problem you assume you are addressing. But in starting the conversation about what is needed to prevent and end unaccompanied child homelessness towards the end of my talk, I'm also hoping to provide the starting frame for our following joint conversation about what is needed to end unaccompanied child homelessness in Tasmania. Drawing across what I've learnt through my research that I've just, briefly pointed to, I have developed a discussion paper which outlines what I see as the range of key interventions that should be considered as part of a coordinated approach to end unaccompanied child homelessness in Tasmania. And you can download that resource freely from the Social Action and Research Centre website, which sits within the website of Anglicare Tasmania. And that document's called A Public Health Approach to Ending Unaccompanied Child Homelessness. Look it up, download it. And in a moment, I'm just going to put up a summary of the ideas presented in that discussion paper on the screen, and I'm praying the technology works. And then we can spend some time talking through it. But I want to preface us looking at the model I've put together for responding to unaccompanied child homelessness by saying that a collection of ideas about ending child homelessness is only ever going to be useful if there is clear whole of government recognition of and responsibility for addressing the care, safety, education and broader wellbeing needs of this cohort. Beyond whole of government recognition and responsibility, there needs to be a bureaucratic leadership hub which can drive, coordinate and compel that whole of government vision of and commitment to highly vulnerable children in this state. And Tasmania is at a potential and hopeful turning point, I think, with policy development being undertaken by Department of Communities on under 16 homelessness and the development of a broader child and youth wellbeing strategy under construction. For my part, I want to see a distinct, empowered operational unit emerge from these strategic processes, which can lead our state in championing and responding to the needs of highly vulnerable children. Now, what I'm putting up, and hopefully it's going to work. One moment.
chat.
Can you hear me still?
We're still here.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to, sorry about that. I'm not quite sure what happened. I'm just going to retry.
Don't worry, we're happy to wait.
Okay. I'm just trying to, get open the screen. Which keeps disappearing. So what happens when you premise your talk on a visual? 2 minutes, coming.
You're not the only one that's had trouble.
Oh, I'm sure. You'd think we'd all be totally across it by now.
No, we're not.
Okay, so I have it up, but is that not showing for you, I gather?
No.
I can't work out where my... Oh, I'm really sorry. Okay, here we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Oh, my apologies.
Don't worry.
Okay. So, thanks everyone for bearing with me while I just technologically embarrass myself. I'm hoping you can now all see that clearly. And again, just to recall what I was saying before I completely, lost my technological vibe. What I was saying is that any kind of collection of ideas like this is only going to kind of work in a context in which there's a broader bureaucratic leadership and commitment and whole of government commitment to actually addressing the issue at hand, in this case, unaccompanied child homelessness. So unless, again, there's political and bureaucratic will, interagency working and accountability, any collection of ideas is always going to struggle to get over the line. Now, before you all start looking at all the text in this visual, there are just a few basic things that I want you to notice, I suppose, first of all. And let's just start with the shape of the diagram that you see. And what you'll see there is that I've brought together a range of suggested systemic changes, interventions and supports within what I like to describe as the anarchist triangle of a public health approach. Now, of course, there are limitations with taking a public health approach, and if you're interested, we can also talk about that. But what I think is highly valuable is the way in which this approach encourages an all systems vision about what is needed, not just to respond to an issue, but to stop it from occurring or reoccurring in the first place. And what you can also see is that I have stepped out the range or suite of systemic changes, interventions and supports that may be needed in different moments of a child's journey through harm and healing. And again, the logic built into this vision stems from a good enough understanding of what the problem is, so that you know what to put in place at the front end to stop it from happening in the first place. And circling back to the earlier parts of my talk, it's this depth of vision of the issue of unaccompanied child homelessness that I think has been missing, such that we've been endlessly caught out providing responses after long journeys of harm have already occurred. So pictured here, now that you can finally see it, is what I would describe as a full infrastructure of care, premised on a good understanding of the root cause of unaccompanied child homelessness. And you'll note, therefore, a real emphasis looking up at universal responses on prevention and early intervention in the basic areas of health, family and school settings in particular. And then as you move down the Anacus triangle, you'll see a focus of each of these areas then carried out into targeted, intensive and long-term intensive actions, which I'm arguing on the basis of the work that I've been doing here in Tassie are needed to prevent, respond quickly and stop the reoccurrence of unaccompanied child homelessness in Tasmania. Now, it would be great to unpack this and your own ideas further, but I'd just like to point out that it is certainly the case that interventions under intensive responses and long-term intensive responses are most immediately needed in Tasmania to keep those currently unaccompanied homeless children safe and, where possible, also engage with family. But I guess I'm really keen to target discussion on different areas of intervention or on specific interventions that you see up there themselves that you, the audience, are most interested in, because obviously there's such short time, I can't unpack all of it. So Elizabeth, sorry for the delay in getting that visual up, but hopefully people having an opportunity to have a look at it will prompt them to ask about different elements that they have a particular focus on or interest in.
As I said before, Catherine, you know, you're not the first one. We all have those things happen, so please don't worry about it. I'm not sure if we've got any written questions as yet, but I have one that I'd like to ask you. Would you talk to us a little bit about maybe the most successful response that you've seen? And I don't know whether there's any, I'm not sure about the unaccompanied here in Tasmania. Quite frankly, I haven't had much experience of that. So just perhaps a little.
Sure. Look, I have to say that whilst of course I'm very concerned here to put together a model which really is about making that shift towards prevention, because ideally that is what we are trying to move towards, actually ending unaccompanied child homelessness. However, of course, I'm always compromised in my thinking because I do work with children who are currently homeless right now. And so I'm particularly interested in responses that work to support children once they have actually already experienced homelessness. And there's a fantastic service that I've come across in South Australia called Rubies. And Rubies is a really interesting model which I guess combines a range of the supports that in Tasmania we offer in often very separated ways. So it is a supported accommodation facility, but it is staffed and funded to really provide the intensive family reunification work that we would want to see happen with this particular age group. So this stands in contrast to a traditional youth specialist homeless service, for example, which in Tasmania operates with a one-worker model and a complete lack of resources to do that kind of family reunification work. And so therefore it's no surprise that, of course, what we're doing is actually skilling homeless children to become homeless youths, to become homeless adults. So what's different about the Rubies model, for example, which is run by Uniting Communities, is that they actually have significant parent engagement, and the child is enabled to spend a decreasing amount of time at Rubies and more time at home with parents. But all parties are deeply engaged in family reunification work with a psychologist and youth worker who also are part of this particular service model. So yes, that's just one example I've come across of what I see as an outstanding model, which has quite extraordinary results in their documentation of it anyway. A very successful rate of returning unaccompanied homeless children to family, whether that's extended family or the parental home.
Seems like a great one. We do have another question for you now, and I think you might have just answered it almost. Is the government doing anything for children under 15 in the way of accommodation?
Yes, we have Colville Place, operated by Colony 47 in the south of the state, and that's an accommodation service that is open to children specifically under the age of 16. So at the moment, that's the key response for the state in terms of a specialist offering focused on children in this age group. As I mentioned, there is currently policy work going on where there is a group of both government and non-government representatives working together to think through how do we improve our responses to unaccompanied homeless children in Tasmania. That, I believe, will be reporting mid-year. So it will be very interesting to see what it is that that group actually recommends and is actually able to lead and put in place at policy, potentially legislative level, but also, of course, in terms of improved and specialist service responses for the unique needs of this particular cohort.
And do they use any of the strategies of the other one that you spoke about, Rubik's or
Rubies? No. As far as I understand it, whilst there is greater scope and slightly increased staffing to try and support children to make those family connections, in terms of an explicit model of family reunification, I stand to be corrected, of course, but I don't understand that as what is currently in operation at Colville. But look, this is a broader question as to what models are government prepared to fund. Of course, one can only deliver to one's budget. So this is about reconsidering what are our priorities, what kind of care do we believe this cohort needs that might be different from what's usually on offer in our youth specialist homeless services.
And do you know much about the cost of Rubies? I mean, is it extortionate? Is it possible? Sounds so good, doesn't it? Sharing extra time at home with still somewhere to go. Any idea?
Look, only a very rough idea. From what I understand, I wouldn't expect it to cost a huge amount more than the youth at risk response centres, as that's what Colville is characterised as in Tasmania. I think it's the additional funding for the full-time role of a psychologist on site at all times would be one significant area of additional cost, I'd say. And also where that model and other models in New South Wales operate, only senior highly qualified staff are employed. So there's also a question here about workforce development and using quite specialist staff in recognition of the fact that there's actually complex family reunification and psychological work that needs to take place, as well as just basic care.
And the other thing I wonder, I mean, we don't have them in Tasmania, but the trauma informed service for young people, it would be possible, wouldn't it, to combine, say, some of both in the same model? Because I think what we do is something different for every single problem that we have, rather than looking at it all and seeing how we could have centres which deal with, or a facility which deals with all of that. And I think the Commissioner for Children, if she was on the other end, would probably be saying something like that. We really need to, think about a more home-like and a much more widespread service kind of approach with
Look, I think
trauma.
you're absolutely right. And importantly, this is about bringing services to children. Remembering that these are children who are not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. So for them to be able to coordinate and across the range of services they may need, as frontline workers will tell you, it doesn't happen. How can it? We wouldn't ask that of our own children. So bringing services to where children are, I think, is a critical part of a good response to this particular group. And yes, that absolutely includes trauma work. But more broadly, making sure that we're all operating within a trauma-informed system which can accommodate the particular issues that arise for kids when trauma has been an accumulated and ongoing part of their lives.
Were there any other things that really struck you about the stories that they told you of, the experience of living unaccompanied and homeless?
Yeah, look, I would say that children's, or this particular group's, lack of access to education is really striking. And that's why when you look at the model of responses that I've put together, really strengthening through legislation our education response for children who experience homelessness is a real pivot. If we're going to talk about early intervention and prevention, then schools obviously are the only statutory service that children are having contact with. So there's always, a good opportunity to start work in much earlier identification of those children who are experiencing homelessness, and providing much more immediate response to that. So we could think about universal screening, for example, of school students. Again, you'll see that there in the model under universal interventions. But then, as in the US, for example, there's legislation which actually ensures and compels states to have specific homeless liaison officers who are responsible for navigating the education system and ensuring education access for those children who experience homelessness, both unaccompanied or accompanied by their families. So there are really good existing examples of interventions that could work, because going back to your original question, what's so striking is the fact that these kids aren't at school. They're just not, and often for very extended periods of time. So, not just a week, but terms or even years. And what we know, of course, is the importance of education in future-proofing our children and setting them up for a life of autonomy and indeed lifelong learning, which is what we'd hope for all our children. So for me, that's just an example of something that was very noticeable in the lives of children that I interviewed. But also just to highlight that there are key examples of interventions at universal, targeted and intensive levels that we know would work to intervene in that really poor education trajectory.
What strikes me about what you've just said is Peter, whose last name escapes me right at this moment, but an ex-school principal who yesterday was talking about classroom situations and the one kind of educational approach to many, many children was not the way to go. And I guess if he was here, he'd be saying those kids are learning anyway, but we would need to harvest what it is they are learning so that they felt some success. I think there's an opportunity to talk to other people about that. So, but look, Catherine, I think we've just about run out of time. So
no problem.
That's a fascinating piece of research, and I'm sure others like me have enjoyed it. And we would look forward to, hearing what happens in the end. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the participants. And don't forget, if you want to continue the conversation, go to Slack. I've never been to Slack, so I don't really know what I'm talking about. But the other thing, of course, if you're watching, and just watch the Anglicare results of this conference, and you will certainly be able to have a better look and share. So thank you very much, Catherine. We really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And please, to the audience, feel free to send me an email or check out the full discussion paper, which sets out the approach to ending unaccompanied child homelessness that I've developed through SARC.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.